I was staring at the wreckage of my mailbox from my living room window when I realized that living in Meadowbrook Estates, a planned community in Naperville, Illinois, was about to become a whole lot more complicated than I had ever imagined. The twisted metal post lay across my front lawn. The wooden box itself had splintered into pieces scattered across the sidewalk, and tire tracks cut deep grooves through my carefully maintained grass. What made this situation truly bizarre was that the driver who had caused this destruction was now standing on my doorstep, not to apologize, but to threaten me with legal action. My name is Vance, and I had moved into this quiet suburban neighborhood 6 months ago, thinking I had found the perfect place to settle down after my divorce. The house was a modest 2-story colonial with a decent yard, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful enough. I worked as an electrical engineer for a manufacturing company downtown, and the commute was reasonable. Life had been going smoothly until this particular Tuesday morning in March, when everything went sideways. I had been drinking my coffee and getting ready for work when I heard the crash. It was loud enough to rattle my windows, a metallic crunch followed by the sound of splintering wood. I rushed to the window and saw a silver Mercedes SUV backing away from what used to be my mailbox, its front bumper dented and hanging loose. The driver got out, and I recognized her immediately. Brenda Patterson, the vice president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, a woman in her mid-50s with an angular face, blonde hair styled in a sharp bob, and a permanent expression that suggested she was perpetually disappointed in everyone around her. I grabbed my jacket and headed outside, expecting an apology and an exchange of insurance information. Instead, what I got was something entirely different. "Mr. Vance," Brenda said sharply as I approached. She was holding her phone, taking pictures of my destroyed mailbox and the surrounding area. "I need to document this hazard immediately." "Hazard?" I looked at the wreckage, then at her damaged vehicle. "You just drove into my mailbox." "Your mailbox was improperly positioned," she said, not even looking at me as she continued snapping photos. "It extends too far into the street right-of-way, which makes it a traffic hazard. Furthermore, you failed to post adequate warning signs indicating its presence." I actually laughed. It was such an absurd statement that I could not help myself. Warning signs? For a mailbox? "Brenda, you drove onto my property and destroyed my mailbox. This is pretty straightforward." She finally looked at me, her eyes cold. I was executing a routine neighborhood inspection, driving at a safe and legal speed, when I was forced to swerve due to a distracted driver coming from the opposite direction. Your illegally positioned mailbox left me with no safe alternative. Had there been proper reflective markers or warning signage, this accident could have been avoided. "There was no other car," I said, my patience already wearing thin. "I saw the whole thing from my window. You were looking at your phone and drifted onto my lawn." Her face flushed red. "Are you calling me a liar, Mr. Vance?" "I am calling you someone who just crashed into my mailbox and is now trying to blame me for it." "You will be hearing from my attorney," she said, getting back into her Mercedes, "and from the HOA board. That mailbox was never approved, and its positioning violates multiple community guidelines. You are in clear violation, and you will be held responsible for the damages to my vehicle." She drove off, leaving me standing there in complete disbelief. I looked down at my ruined mailbox, then at the tire tracks across my lawn. This was going to be a problem. I called my insurance company first, then took my own photos of everything. The agent I spoke with seemed confused by the situation, especially when I explained that the person who hit my mailbox was threatening to sue me. He suggested I file a police report to document the incident, so that was my next call. Officer Martinez arrived about 40 minutes later. He was a young guy, probably in his late 20s, with a professional demeanor and a notepad already in hand. I walked him through what happened, showed him my view from the living room window, and pointed out the trajectory of the tire tracks. "So she hit your mailbox, admitted it, but says it is your fault?" he asked, writing everything down. "Exactly. She claims I should have had warning signs posted." He looked at the remains of my mailbox, then at the street. "Mr. Vance, your mailbox was positioned exactly where it should be, right at the property line next to the curb. There is nothing illegal or hazardous about its placement. If anything, she would have had to drive significantly off the road to hit it like this." That is what I thought. He took measurements, documented everything with his own photos, and gave me a case number. I am going to write this up as a single vehicle accident with property damage. The driver left the scene without exchanging insurance information, which is technically a violation. But since you know who she is and where to find her, it is not exactly a hit and run. You should be able to pursue this through insurance or small claims court. She mentioned getting the HOA involved. Officer Martinez gave me a sympathetic look. HOAs can be tricky. I would recommend documenting everything, keeping all communications in writing if possible, and consulting with an attorney if things escalate. From a legal standpoint, she was clearly at fault here. After he left, I called my neighbor, Tom Reynolds, who lived 2 doors down. Tom was a retired high school teacher, a friendly guy in his 60s who had lived in Meadowbrook Estates for over a decade. If anyone knew how to deal with the HOA, it would be him. "Isaac, come on over," he said when I explained the situation. "You are going to need to understand what you are dealing with." Tom's house was immaculate, his lawn perfectly manicured to HOA standards. His wife brought us coffee, and we sat in his living room while he pulled out a thick binder labeled HOA correspondence. "Brenda Patterson is a piece of work," Tom said, flipping through pages of letters and printed emails. "She has been on the board for 8 years, and in that time, she has made life miserable for dozens of residents. The problem is, she knows the rules inside and out, and she uses them like weapons. Can she actually sue me for her hitting my mailbox? She can sue you for anything. Whether she will win is another matter. But here is what she will do. She will file a complaint with the HOA board, claiming your mailbox was in violation. She will push for fines, penalties, and probably demand that you pay for repairs to her vehicle. Then, if you do not comply, she will escalate through the HOA's legal channels, which means more fines and possibly a lien on your property." I felt my stomach sink. This is insane. Welcome to HOA living. Look, the board president is Gerald Murphy, and he is actually reasonable. The problem is that Brenda basically runs the show because she is the one who does all the enforcement. Gerald mostly rubber stamps whatever she puts in front of him because he does not want the hassle. So, what do I do? Document everything, like you are already doing. Get a copy of the police report. Then, request a copy of all HOA guidelines regarding mailbox placement and installation. I am willing to bet your mailbox was completely compliant. When she files her complaint, you will need to respond in writing and request a formal hearing with the board. Over the next few days, I did exactly that. I received my copy of the police report, which clearly stated that Brenda Patterson had struck my mailbox due to driver error, and that the mailbox was properly positioned. I sent a certified letter to Brenda requesting her insurance information for property damage claims. I also requested a full copy of the HOA's governing documents from the property management company that handled administrative tasks for Meadowbrook Estates. The response from Brenda came exactly 1 week after the incident. It was not her insurance information. It was a formal notice from an attorney named Richard Blackwell, who was representing Brenda in a personal injury and property damage lawsuit against me. The letter claimed that my improperly installed and unmarked mailbox structure had caused Brenda to swerve her vehicle to avoid a collision, resulting in damage to her Mercedes and severe emotional distress and physical injuries, including neck strain and psychological trauma. The letter demanded I pay $12,000 for vehicle repairs, medical expenses, and pain and suffering. If I did not agree to settle within 10 days, they would file a lawsuit in civil court. I sat at my kitchen table, reading the letter 3 times to make sure I was not misunderstanding something. She was not only refusing to take responsibility, but was actually trying to extort money from me for damaging my property. I called my insurance company again. My agent, a woman named Patricia, sounded as frustrated as I felt. "Mr. Vance, I have reviewed everything you sent us. Our position is clear. The other driver was at fault. We will cover your mailbox replacement under your homeowner's policy, less your deductible. As for her claim against you, we would normally provide liability defense, but based on the evidence, we do not believe there is any liability on your part. If she sues you, we will provide an attorney to represent you." So I just wait for her to sue me. Unfortunately, yes. But I would not worry too much. Her claim has no merit and any judge will see that immediately. I wanted to believe her, but Tom's warnings about HOA politics kept nagging at me. I decided to hire my own attorney, just to be safe. After some research and a few consultations, I retained a lawyer named David Friedman who specialized in property disputes and HOA issues. He was in his 40s, with a calm, methodical approach that put me at ease. "This is a fairly straightforward case of someone trying to shift blame after causing an accident," David said during our first meeting at his office in downtown Naperville. "The police report alone will tank her case. The question is whether she is serious about pursuing this or just trying to intimidate you into paying. She seems pretty serious. Then we will be ready. I am also going to send a letter to her attorney, putting them on notice that we intend to countersue for the damage to your mailbox, your legal fees, and any additional costs incurred due to her frivolous claim. Sometimes that is enough to make people back down." Meanwhile, the HOA complaint arrived. It was a formal notice on Meadowbrook Estates letterhead, signed by Brenda Patterson in her capacity as VP of the board. The complaint alleged that my mailbox had been installed without proper HOA approval, that it violated setback requirements, and that it lacked required reflective markings. I was being fined $500, and I was required to remove the mailbox debris immediately and submit plans for a new, compliant mailbox within 30 days. David reviewed the complaint and the HOA's governing documents. "Your mailbox was completely compliant," he said. I checked the installation guidelines, and standard mailboxes at the curb do not require pre-approval. The setback she is citing applies to decorative structures like brick mailbox enclosures, not standard post-mounted boxes, and there is no requirement anywhere for reflective markings. So she is just making this up. She is interpreting the rules in the most extreme way possible to support her position. We need to respond formally and request a hearing. I will draft the response. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork, letters, and certified mailings. David sent a strongly worded response to Brenda's attorney, which included the police report, photos of the accident scene, and a demand for payment of my damages. He also drafted my response to the HOA complaint, citing the specific sections of the governing documents that proved my mailbox was compliant, and requesting a formal hearing before the full board. I also had to deal with the practical matter of replacing my mailbox. I bought a new one from the hardware store, identical to the previous one, and installed it in exactly the same location. 2 days later, I received another HOA violation notice. This time, Brenda claimed the mailbox was installed without approval and demanded I remove it immediately or face daily fines of $100. I called Tom Reynolds again, and he suggested I start attending the monthly HOA board meetings. "You need to make your case publicly," he said. "Brenda operates in the shadows, sending letters and making threats. If you show up and speak during the open forum, the other residents will see what is happening. She hates public scrutiny." The next board meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at the community clubhouse, a small building near the neighborhood entrance that was used for events and meetings. I arrived 15 minutes early and was surprised to see about 30 other residents already there. Tom had saved me a seat near the front. The board sat at a long table facing the audience. Gerald Murphy, the president, was a heavy-set man in his 70s with white hair and a tired expression. Beside him was Brenda, looking as severe as ever, flanked by 3 other board members I did not recognize. Gerald called the meeting to order and started with routine business, approving minutes from the last meeting and discussing the budget for landscaping services. Then came the open forum, where residents could speak for up to 3 minutes each on any topic. I raised my hand, and Gerald nodded at me. "State your name and address, please." "Isaac Vance, 2847 Maple Ridge Drive. I want to address a situation involving a complaint filed against me by Miss Patterson." I kept my voice steady and professional. "3 weeks ago, Miss Patterson drove her vehicle into my mailbox, destroying it completely. Instead of taking responsibility, she has filed an HOA complaint against me, claiming my mailbox was improperly installed. I have a police report that clearly states she was at fault. I have also been threatened with a lawsuit demanding I pay for damage to her vehicle. This is not only unfair, it is an abuse of her position on this board." There was murmuring in the audience. Gerald looked uncomfortable. Brenda's face turned red. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice sharp, "this is not the appropriate forum for discussing ongoing enforcement matters. Your complaint is being handled through proper channels. With all due respect, you are the one who filed the complaint. I am simply letting the board and the community know that your complaint is retaliation for an accident you caused. I have documentation proving my mailbox was compliant with all HOA rules." "That is for the board to determine," Brenda snapped. Gerald cleared his throat. "Mr. Vance, you have requested a formal hearing, correct?" "Yes, my attorney sent that request 2 weeks ago." "Then we will schedule that hearing for next month's meeting. You will have an opportunity to present your evidence at that time." I sat down, satisfied that I had at least made my position public. Several residents came up to me after the meeting, offering their support and sharing their own stories of conflicts with Brenda. It seemed I was far from the only person who had been on the receiving end of her enforcement tactics. One woman, Carol Andrews, told me about how Brenda had fined her $2,000 for painting her front door a shade of blue that was supposedly not on the approved color list. "She made my life hell for 6 months, Carol said. I eventually had to hire a lawyer, and we proved that the color I used was on the approved list. She still never apologized." Another man, James, described a situation where Brenda had tried to force him to remove a vegetable garden from his backyard, claiming it violated the landscaping guidelines. She actually came onto my property without permission to take photos, he said. I had to threaten her with a trespassing charge to get her to back off. These stories painted a clear picture. Brenda Patterson was not just difficult, she was abusing her authority to bully residents into compliance. The problem was that most people did not have the time, money, or energy to fight back, so they either paid the fines or moved out of the neighborhood. The lawsuit arrived 2 weeks later. Brenda, through her attorney, filed a civil complaint in Kane County Circuit Court, claiming negligence, property damage, and personal injury. The amount she was seeking had increased to $25,000. David reviewed the complaint and shook his head. This is complete nonsense, but we are going to have to go through the process. The good news is that we have a strong case for dismissal and an even stronger countersuit. The bad news is that this will take time and cost you money, even though you are going to win. Can we go after her for filing a frivolous lawsuit? Absolutely. Illinois law allows for sanctions against parties who file baseless claims. Once we get this dismissed, we will file a motion for sanctions and attorney fees. We will also pursue your counterclaim for the mailbox damage, your legal costs, and punitive damages for harassment. The next few months were stressful. I spent hours with David, going over every detail of the case, preparing my testimony and gathering evidence. We subpoenaed Brenda's phone records to prove she was using her phone at the time of the accident. We obtained statements from neighbors who had witnessed her erratic driving. We even hired an accident reconstruction expert who analyzed the tire tracks and conclusively proved that Brenda had driven onto my property at an angle inconsistent with avoiding another vehicle. Meanwhile, the HOA hearing finally took place in May. The board met in a special session, with all 5 members present and about 20 residents in attendance. David accompanied me, and we presented a thorough, organized case. He showed the board the police report, the photographic evidence, the relevant sections of the HOA guidelines, and statements from neighbors supporting my position. Brenda tried to argue that my mailbox had been a nuisance and hazard, but she could not provide any evidence to support that claim. When Gerald asked her directly if she had been distracted while driving, she became defensive and evasive, which only made her look worse. The other board members seemed uncomfortable with the situation. One of them, a middle-aged man named Peter, asked pointed questions about why Brenda had not simply filed an insurance claim for the accident like a normal person. Brenda's answers were rambling and contradictory. After an hour of testimony and discussion, Gerald called for a vote on the complaint. The motion to fine me and require mailbox removal failed by a vote of 4-1, with only Brenda voting in favor. Gerald then made a formal statement that my mailbox was compliant with all HOA rules and that the complaint was dismissed. I felt a wave of relief, but David reminded me that the lawsuit was still ongoing. This helps our case significantly, he said. The HOA itself has now determined that your mailbox was compliant. That undermines her entire legal theory. The court case moved slowly through the system. We filed a motion to dismiss, arguing that Brenda's complaint failed to state a valid claim. Her attorney filed a response, but it was weak and full of the same unfounded allegations. In August, we had a hearing before Judge Elizabeth Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for not tolerating frivolous litigation. David presented our case methodically. He showed the police report, the HOA board decision, the expert analysis, and the phone records proving Brenda had been using her phone at the time of the accident. He argued that not only should the case be dismissed, but that sanctions should be imposed for filing a baseless lawsuit. Brenda's attorney, Richard, tried to salvage the case, but Judge Morrison cut him off repeatedly, asking for actual evidence to support their claims. Richard had none. He kept falling back on vague assertions about community safety and inadequate warning measures, but he could not point to any law or regulation that required homeowners to post warning signs for mailboxes. After hearing both sides, Judge Morrison did not even take time to deliberate. "I am granting the motion to dismiss with prejudice," she said firmly. "This lawsuit never should have been filed. The evidence overwhelmingly shows that Miss Patterson was at fault for the accident, and her claim that the plaintiff was negligent is completely unsupported. Furthermore, I am granting the plaintiff's motion for sanctions. Miss Patterson and her attorney will be jointly and severally liable for the plaintiff's attorney fees and costs." She turned to Richard. "Counselor, I expect better from members of the bar. Filing a lawsuit with no factual or legal basis wastes the court's time and harms your client's credibility. Consider this a warning." Richard looked pale. Brenda, sitting at the plaintiff's table, was staring straight ahead, her face frozen in a mixture of shock and anger. But we were not done yet. David immediately filed our counterclaim, seeking damages for the destroyed mailbox, my attorney fees, the time I had lost from work dealing with this situation, and punitive damages for malicious prosecution and abuse of process. The counterclaim hearing was scheduled for October. In the meantime, something interesting happened in the HOA. Several residents, emboldened by my successful fight against Brenda, started organizing a campaign to recall her from the board. Tom Reynolds was leading the effort, gathering signatures and holding meetings at people's homes. "We have had enough," Tom told me one evening over beers on his back patio. "Brenda has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years, and you finally stood up to her. People are ready for change." The recall petition required signatures from 20% of the homeowners, which was about 80 households. Within 3 weeks, they had over 100 signatures. The petition was submitted to the board, and a special election was scheduled for September. Brenda fought the recall viciously. She sent letters to every household, claiming the recall was being orchestrated by rule breakers and malcontents who wanted to turn Meadowbrook Estates into a lawless community. She held a candidates forum at the clubhouse, where she defended her record and attacked the recall organizers. But it backfired. At the forum, resident after resident stood up and told their stories of harassment, excessive fines, and Brenda's abuse of power. The more she tried to defend herself, the worse she looked. By the end of the evening, even Gerald Murphy seemed ready for her to go. The special election was held on a Saturday in late September. The turnout was massive, with over 70% of homeowners casting ballots. The recall passed by a margin of 2-1. Brenda Patterson was removed from the HOA board effective immediately. The next day, I saw her putting a "for sale" sign in her front yard. Within 2 months, she had moved out of Meadowbrook Estates entirely. The counterclaim hearing in October was almost anticlimactic. David presented a detailed accounting of my damages, including the cost of the mailbox, my attorney fees from both the lawsuit defense and the HOA dispute, lost wages, and emotional distress. He also argued for punitive damages, citing Brenda's pattern of abusive behavior and the frivolous nature of her lawsuit. Brenda's attorney, Richard, tried to negotiate a settlement at the last minute, but I refused. I wanted a judgment on the record, something that would follow Brenda and serve as a warning to others who might consider similar tactics. Judge Morrison ruled in my favor on all counts. She awarded me $8,000 in compensatory damages and an additional $15,000 in punitive damages. Combined with the earlier sanctions order, Brenda owed me over $30,000. Collecting the judgment took a few more months. David filed liens and garnishment orders, and eventually we recovered most of the money from the proceeds of Brenda's house sale. It was not about the money for me. It was about the principle. She had tried to bully me, to abuse her authority, and to use the legal system as a weapon. She had lost on every front. Life in Meadowbrook Estates improved dramatically after Brenda's departure. The board elected a new vice president, a retired accountant named Susan, who took a collaborative, common-sense approach to enforcement. Violations were handled with friendly reminders rather than threats and fines. The neighborhood felt more like a community and less like a police state. I rebuilt my mailbox, exactly where it had been before. This time, though, Tom and a few other neighbors threw a mailbox dedication party on my front lawn, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a hand-painted sign that read, "Warning, mailbox ahead." It was their way of celebrating the victory and poking fun at the absurdity of what we had all been through. One afternoon in December, almost 9 months after the initial incident, I was outside raking leaves when Carol Andrews walked over from across the street. She had been one of the most vocal supporters of the recall effort. "Isaac, I just wanted to thank you again," she said. "What you did, standing up to Brenda, it changed everything around here. A lot of us were just too tired or too scared to fight back. You showed us it was possible." "I just did not want to pay for something that was not my fault," I said. "It was more than that. You held her accountable. You proved that these little tyrants do not have absolute power, no matter how much they act like they do." She was right, in a way. The whole experience had taught me something important about standing up for yourself, even when it feels overwhelming. HOAs exist to maintain property values and enforce reasonable community standards. But when individuals abuse that authority, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a tool for control, harassment, and petty vengeance. The legal system worked eventually, though it took time and cost money. The police report was crucial. Officer Martinez's professional documentation of the accident scene provided the foundation for everything that followed. Without that official record, it would have been my word against Brenda's, and the outcome might have been very different. David's expertise was invaluable too. He knew how to navigate both the HOA dispute process and the civil litigation system. He kept me focused on facts and evidence rather than emotions, which was important because I was angry throughout most of the process. Anger can cloud judgment and lead to mistakes, but having a good attorney helps channel that anger into effective legal strategy. The community support mattered as well. When other residents came forward with their stories, it became clear that Brenda's behavior was part of a larger pattern. That pattern evidence was powerful, both in the HOA hearing and in court. It showed that this was not just a one-time misunderstanding, but a deliberate course of conduct. I learned a lot about HOA law during those months. I learned that governing documents are contracts, and they have to be interpreted according to their plain language. I learned that board members have fiduciary duties to the community, and they can be held personally liable if they breach those duties. I learned that homeowners have rights, including due process rights when facing fines or other penalties. I also learned that most HOA disputes never go as far as mine did. Most people pay the fine or comply with the demand because fighting seems too hard or too expensive. That is what people like Brenda count on. They use the threat of escalating costs and legal action to force compliance, even when they are in the wrong. It is a form of legal bullying that works because most people cannot afford to fight back. But sometimes fighting back is worth it, not just for yourself, but for everyone else in the community. The recall election and Brenda's departure created a ripple effect. The new board adopted policies to make enforcement more transparent and fair. They created an appeal process for violations that did not require hiring an attorney. They published clear guidelines for common issues like mailbox placement, fence heights, and landscaping choices. Susan, the new vice president, told me she wanted to make sure what happened to me never happened to anyone else in Meadowbrook Estates. She was true to her word. Under her leadership, the board focused on education and cooperation rather than punishment and control. My mailbox stands today exactly where it always was, at the curb by my front lawn on Maple Ridge Drive. It is a simple black post-mounted box with my house number in reflective numbers. There are no warning signs, no flashing lights, no orange cones. Just a normal mailbox in a normal spot, exactly as it should be. Sometimes when I get my mail in the evening, I think about that morning in March when this all started. I think about the sound of the crash, the sight of Brenda standing there with her phone taking pictures, her audacity in trying to blame me for her own mistake. I think about how differently things could have gone if I had just accepted her version of events or paid her off to make the problem go away. But I did not, and I am glad I did not. The process was stressful and time-consuming, but it was also empowering. It reminded me that individuals can stand up to institutions and win, that bullies eventually face consequences, and that communities can change for the better when people refuse to accept unreasonable treatment. The money I recovered from the judgment covered all my expenses, and then some. I donated part of it to a local legal aid society that helps low-income homeowners with HOA disputes. David thought that was fitting. "You were lucky you could afford to fight," he said. "A lot of people cannot. This will help level the playing field for others." In February of the following year, almost exactly 1 year after the incident, I received a letter from Richard Blackwell, Brenda's former attorney. It was short and professional, informing me that he was closing his file on the case and wishing me well. There was no mention of Brenda or where she had moved to, and I did not care. She was no longer my problem, no longer the neighborhood's problem. Tom Reynolds organized a 1-year anniversary party, which he jokingly called Mailbox Freedom Day. About 50 residents showed up at the clubhouse for an afternoon barbecue. People brought food, kids played on the lawn, and someone even made a cake decorated with a picture of a mailbox. It was silly and wonderful, a celebration of community and common sense prevailing over pettiness and abuse. Gerald Murphy, who was still serving as board president, gave a short speech thanking everyone who had participated in the recall and the reform efforts. "This neighborhood is stronger because of what happened," he said. "We learned that we cannot just sit back and let others make decisions for us. We have to stay engaged, hold our leaders accountable, and remember that this is our community, not theirs." I appreciated his words, even though I knew he was partly to blame for letting Brenda run wild for so many years. But people can change, and institutions can improve. The important thing was that Meadowbrook Estates was now a better place to live. My life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets. I still worked downtown, still maintained my house and lawn to reasonable standards, still chatted with neighbors and attended the occasional board meeting. The difference was that I no longer felt like I was living under constant surveillance, waiting for the next violation notice to arrive in my mailbox. One evening in late spring, I was grilling burgers in my backyard when my doorbell rang. I walked around to the front and found a young couple standing there, looking nervous but hopeful. They introduced themselves as potential buyers who were looking at a house 2 streets over. "We heard this is a nice neighborhood," the woman said, but we have had bad experiences with HOAs before. Do you mind if I ask what it is like living here? I smiled and invited them to sit on my front porch. I told them the whole story, not sugarcoating anything but also explaining how the community had come together to fix the problems. I showed them my mailbox and laughed about the warning signs that were never needed. "So things are better now?" the man asked. "Much better. The board is reasonable, the rules are clear, and people actually help each other instead of looking for violations. It is what an HOA should be." They seemed relieved and thanked me for my honesty. A few weeks later, I saw a moving truck at the house they had been looking at. They had bought it and were moving in. I walked over to welcome them to the neighborhood, and we all had a good laugh about mailboxes and HOA horror stories. That is the thing about communities. They are made up of people, and people can make them better or worse depending on their choices. For a while, Meadowbrook Estates was worse because one person with a little bit of power decided to abuse it. But then other people chose to stand up, to fight back, to demand something better. And the community became stronger as a result. I never regretted fighting Brenda's lawsuit or challenging the HOA complaint. It cost me time and money, and there were moments when I wondered if it was worth the stress. But in the end, it absolutely was. Not just because I won, though that was satisfying, but because it reminded me that principles matter, that justice is possible, and that ordinary people can make a difference when they refuse to be pushed around. My mailbox is still there, standing tall at the curb on Maple Ridge Drive. It gets filled with letters and packages, bills and advertisements, the ordinary mail of an ordinary life in an ordinary suburb. But to me, it represents something more. It represents the fact that I stood my ground, fought for what was right, and won. It represents the idea that home ownership means something, that property rights matter, and that no one, not even an HOA board member with an inflated sense of authority, can take those rights away without a fight. Every time I check my mail, I remember that lesson. And every time I see new residents moving into the neighborhood, I hope they never have to learn it the way I did, but I am glad I can share the story if they need to hear it. Because somewhere out there, in another planned community in another suburb, someone else is probably dealing with their own HOA nightmare. Maybe my story can give them hope, show them it is possible to fight back and win. The American dream includes homeownership, the idea that you can have your own piece of property, your own space to live as you choose within reasonable bounds. But that dream becomes a nightmare when petty tyrants use homeowners associations as tools of control rather than community governance. It takes courage to stand up to that kind of abuse, but it also takes something else. A belief that the system, for all its flaws, can still work if you are willing to put in the effort. I put in the effort, and the system worked. The police documented the truth. The HOA board eventually did the right thing. The court saw through the frivolous lawsuit. The community rallied together to remove a bad actor. And in the end, justice prevailed. My name is Isaac Vance. I live at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive in Naperville, Illinois, and I won. Not because I am special or because I had some advantage others do not have, but because I refused to accept an injustice, and I was willing to fight for what was right. That is a story worth telling, and it is a lesson worth remembering. The mailbox stands as a monument to that lesson, a simple metal box on a wooden post at the edge of my property. It has no warning signs, no flashing lights, nothing but my house number in reflective digits. And that is exactly how it should be, exactly as it was always meant to be, before one person's arrogance and abuse of power turned it into a battleground. But the battle is over now, and the right side won. The neighborhood is peaceful, The rules are reasonable and the community thrives. That is the ending I wanted, the ending we all deserved. And standing here on my front lawn, looking at my mailbox in the late afternoon sun, I can finally say with complete certainty that it was all worth it.